Plymouth, and I'm just sorry I can't be there, and look forward to the time when I can actually come there, and we can do it the old-fashioned way, because I've yet to visit the school, yet to really know the school, but hear many very exciting things about it. I'm hoping I'm in an empty room in an empty house. We've just moved back from Australia, so I'm hoping it's not, the acoustics aren't too echoey. As you can see, not much in here with me. It's arriving soon. But yes, I'm prepared to talk. Nicolina, it's lovely that reconstructing her practice meant something for you. Nicolina asked me to, in a sense, speak about reconstructing her practice, and I'm not going to, but as I said to her, I'm actually, in a sense, always speaking about that. That started a feminist project that is the kind of undercurrent or subtext of everything I've done since. The book on error absolutely is a feminist project, in case anyone's in any doubt. It's just kind of nicely buried in there, let's say. And what I want to do is to pull together some work that I've been doing on this kind of what I'm calling an indiscrete prehistory of the architect's computer. So some work looking at the work of Ramon Llull, a medieval thinker or 1300s thinker, and some work more recently I've been doing, in a sense, realizing that one cannot work on computation without dealing with the question of chance, because chance, the random, evades computation. So looking at statistics. And this is all going to sound very abstract, but hopefully I can make it very tangible for you quite soon through this. So having worked on error for a long time, it was kind of inevitable that I was going to have to turn to systems of correction, which is what you do when you've worked on mistakes for a long time. And then ultimately that led to the ultimate system of correction, which is computation, the ultimate project of correction. And as I've just said, if you're working on computation as a system of correction, ultimately you have to work on chance, the thing that undoes computation. And in so doing, I discovered that if you're working on corrective systems, you're increasingly working on the future, the question of the future, and the correction of the future via systems of prediction, not least, the enormous systems of prediction that, are currently on watches around our wrists, in phones, in every aspect of everything that we do. And perhaps this is obvious to you, but it actually took me quite a long time to figure it out. So if we think of architecture's two oldest projects being the future and correction, they necessarily converge in the business of prediction. Our newly augmented predictive technologies, the many loops of induction that are now on kind of big data steroids, are powerfully focused on correcting our very next future. This is best epitomized by recent AI applications that combine information metrics with form finding for property developers such as Archistar. I don't know if you've come across it. It's a pretty monstrous platform that, quotes, helps property professionals to find profitable development sites, assess for feasibility, and generate dozens of architectural design strategies all within a few minutes. Or another one is Blocks, whose platform dashboard incorporates real-time adjustable inputs, deep data insights, allowing developers to project assets and financials. So in a sense, just two manifestations of the flow of real-time data currently feeding the, to use Beckett's term, filthy logics at work in the making of our cities. Here's a sample. So it doesn't get much more filthy than that, if you ask me. So indeed, so all-encompassing are the corrective actions at work in so many dimensions of contemporary design and contemporary practice and existence. that we find the present moment has become strangely eclipsed. The present's kind of disappeared. It's reduced to this space in which past predictions are confirmed and future ones are made. In so doing, time itself is effectively colonized by the filthy logics of optimization, optimized consumption, optimized labor, and optimized education. Jacques Derrida famously reminded us French has two words for the future, and it's been very interesting to come back to Derrida's thinking about the future now. The two words are le futur, the future we can calculate and therefore plan for, that is the future we can predict, program, schedule, and organize, and l'Avenir, that which is uncalculable and therefore unpredictable and will actually come to pass. He describes l'Avenir as the other who comes without my being able to anticipate their arrival. How the interruption of l'Avenir might disrupt the schedules of le futur hardly needs explaining today. Anyone who's experienced the last year doesn't need that explained to them. This talk will ever so briefly then explore the very historic, and then medieval, turn to a digital machine that was not binary but ternary in order to calculate the truth, that is the kind of the futur, and ultimately predict the future. And I'll do so in the form of Ramon Llull's 13th-century Ars Magna, and also tying it at the end of the talk to Sir Francis Galton's Queencook. So this is Thomas Lemaire's from his 1321 Breviculum, and this illustrated miniature from the manuscript called The Life of Ramon Llull. And this over here is Sir Francis Galton's Queencooks, which he used to prove the law of error, or we might call it the normal curve or binomial distribution. So Ramon Llull, or Llull, Llull is the kind of bastarding, English mangling of the Spanish Hughes, was born in Majorca in 1232 and was thus positioned at the geographic and temporal edge of the diaspora of the Arab Islamic Renaissance, which unfolded from 800 to 1200. This first Renaissance, this is the Renaissance we're not taught about, was more oriented towards technological innovation than the more pictorial Renaissance, the one that we know about and you've probably all been taught about. Although the second Western Renaissance owes much to the technological transformations of the first very much remains in a lacuna for Western historiography, and Llull too remains in that lacuna. Although his work has been kind of serially forgotten through history, but also retrieved by certain key thinkers through history, and the list of thinkers is very interesting. Alberti, Leibniz, Descartes, Umberto Eco, and Italo Calvino. So in a way, Llull's work always stands for both a distant echo of an event already deleted and for the kind of enduring legacy of our historiographic blind spots. So returning to this image, and I'm going to kind of slightly take apart this image today, what the image depicts is truth abducted to the tower of falsehood. This is the tower of falsehood. Truth is in there, and truth is a she. Truth abducted is being held prisoner then in the tower of falsehoods, from whose battlements and windows hang the monstrous demons, and these are the monstrous demons up here. And their names are here. It's in medieval Latin, which is a tricky thing, but I've had them translated by no less than Mary Beard, so we'll just have to rely on her for this. And their names are, running from left to right, going down: wickedness, inactivity, ignorance, weakness, confusion, disaster or fall, futility and nothingness. And then on the right, depravity or distortion. It's kind of unclear what exactly that term means. Impossibility, hatred, falsity, punishment, contrariness, emptiness, inflexibility, abundance in the sense of excess, and diminution. So I was actually working on this when fake news and the alternative facts were in full blast, and it was kind of incredibly both disturbing and reassuring. This list could apply to everything that Trump used. This sinister tower is, of course, a play on the towers of truth, which access the heavens, and the towers of facts of medieval mnemonics about which Mary Carruthers have written. So back to our image, we can't see truth, but we can hear her. This text underneath is her lament, and this is what she's saying. She says, have mercy on me, at least you, my friends. The hand of ignorance touched me, and in my place unreliable opinion was crowned in public. I, on the other hand, am wholly concealed against my will in the darkness and without light in the depth of this dungeon. Sad, deserted, and almost desperate, I die. There's no one to help me or to give me comfort. On the contrary, many are all more inclined to support the wrong opinion than to free me from the dungeon. All my philosophers, in whom, apart from God, I place all my trust, because you are true lovers of wisdom and truth, come to my aid, I beg you, otherwise I must perish by inaction. So the philosophers have heard, and here they all are riding to her rescue in 3 chariots, which turns out are also towers. They are mobile siege towers. At the front is Aristotle on his horse ratiocinatio, or rational reasoning, but also the name of Leibniz's machine, the calculus ratiocinator, armed with reason and the syllogistic apparatus of Greek logic, the if-then, which Frege and Boole will later pick up in a sense, the kind of final piece of the puzzle of the computer. In his chariot are the 5 general propositions of logic, including, as you may remember, the peculiar and the accidental, because Aristotle was actually very tolerant of the accidental or the erroneous, yet to be excluded then from his formal system. They won't be tolerated much longer. Behind him, and the horse in the middle, is his commentator Averroes, on his horse Imaginatio, and armed with imagination. Averroes' twofold truth held that a proposition may be philosophically true but theologically false, and further argued that we're only capable of thought in union with our body. So in a sense, for Averroes, logic was absolutely inseparable from the body. And at the rear is Ramon Llull, on his horse right intention, recta intentio. Aristotle with his tolerance of the accidental, and Averroes with his pursuit of happiness from observation, are in the business of producing what is described as second-degree knowledge, that is, intellectual knowledge of sensible things in which perception, that is, the body, provides input data. But the axiomatic system of Llull's Logica Nova augments this decorporalization by excluding internal input, i.e. perception entirely, thus producing third-degree knowledge. So if you think about it, first-degree knowledge within this formulation is sensible knowledge of sensible things. So it's knowledge through the senses of the body. Aristotle and Averroes take it 1 degree further with second-degree knowledge. Llull completes the decorporalization with his third-degree knowledge. That is intellectual knowledge of intellectual things, absolutely abstract thought for which we do not need a body, and the senses will provide no trustworthy, no useful input. Precisely then the inward turning abstract thoughts the heretic Averroes is apparently incapable of. Should there be any doubt about the crucial leap that Llull was making, the script on his lance, if you remember the lance in the full picture I showed you earlier, makes the abstracted nature of this newly hermetic system of logic for a vita contemplativa abundantly clear. It says, he who wants to know the spiritual must transcend senses and imagination, and often himself. So he must transcend himself. He must, in a sense, get apart from, decorporalize from himself. This is thought and the production of truth cut off from the senses and getting ready to be housed in the machine of thought that is still as yet to be imagined. But already there's a sense that mechanized thought, being uncontaminated by the error that plagues human condition, the error that is always associated with the body, will necessarily think no falsehoods, will necessarily correctly predict the future. In Llull's chariot ride the 9 absolute principles or concepts of his Ars Magna. And they are, running my way along here, goodness, greatness, duration, power, wisdom, will, virtue, truth, and glory. Basically all pseudonyms for God. And if, in a sense, if you watch it, it's kind of funny that only greatness over here looks like he's having a good time. The rest all look rather miserable. These behind them are, it's a further chariot with the 9 relative principles or predicates: concordance, difference, contrariety, beginning, middle, end, majority, equality, minority. So notice those come in 3 triplets. Lull's system, a point we'll return to, is essentially relational from the start. This is the performative reason for its structure being built of triplets, that is, being ternary or triangulated, not binary. But there's a symbolic reason for this too. Lull's Ars Magna is a missionary project, a system designed to convert Muslims and Jews to Christianity and thus correct, notionally, their faith. In order to be persuasive, the system had to appear neutral or secular. Therefore, there's not a single Christian term within the whole work, within the entire script, but the footprint of the script, the structure of it, is that of the Trinity, is that of the Christian Trinity that is kind of embedded. So triangulation is embedded deep in its architecture. But stay now with these chariots and note, unlike the other 2 chariots, Aristotle's and Averroes' here, Lull's has this chimney. Lull has a souped up engine, the fire column fueling his triadic reasoning system, which this fire, in a sense, is telling us that the machine home of this reasoning system, when it finally arrives, will be prodigiously powered. We meet Lull's passengers again as the 9 letters in his wheels, A and T. Note the collector here is the 9 letters. This is truth, glory, goodness, all of our pseudonyms for God. And note how they're networked. Note the collecting lines which assert from the start their potential mutual transposition, which means that's when you can use it to say God is great, great is good, good is God, and so on. In which the terms are also, note also how these terms are all led activity, i.e. we cannot call something good which does not also produce good, which does not also do good. These principles are all performative. In wheel T, this is all from Lull's Ars, a substructure of lines sets up loyalties between the predicates, there are triplets, that crucially allow indecision, crucially allow a halfway house that expands the either or that ultimately becomes the binary into the more indeterminate and ultimately more generous space of the both and. The undecided is admitted to the system. Thus in figure T, the relational figure we have at the beginning with beginning and end, we also have and middle. With concordance and contrariety, we also have difference. With majority and minority, we also have equality. So something can be bigger than something or smaller than something, or by equality, the same size as something. This combinatorial system culminates in the 4th figure, and here comes the machine, which introduces 3 concentric rotating paper wheels. Here they are, with a pin through the middle so you can rotate them against each other, able to generate tertiary combinations between the principles and the relative principles, establishing what Donald Knuth in the art of computer programming calls Lull's 3-valued logic: true, unknown, and false. If true, false are the categories of the calculable and thus the predictable future, it is the unknown term here that admits Derrida's l'Avenir into the picture then. Like all formal logic and universal language systems that followed, and many of which were inspired by Lull's work and indeed their algorithmic artifact still, Lull's Ars is highly reductive and thus compressive in its makeup. A set of basic truths designed so that any process can be broken down to a series of fundamental operational steps, always kind of in a sense rehearsing the only one thing at a time constraint of the Turing tape, and indeed every computer, no matter how powerful ever since. Reduction, as Giordano Bruno, Athanasius Kircher and Gottfried Leibniz were all to confirm, all of whom devised their own arch systems to compress and reconfigure copious volumes that they'd written into systems that would somehow produce new knowledge, is not simply a response to archival exigencies. This compression isn't just about kind of making it fit into a small thing. This compression understands that reduction is key to the reactivation of knowledge. In a further isomorphism between all of these systems across the centuries, we find that they're all hermetic. This system is closed so that it might claim universality by being exhaustive in its iterative testing of combinatorial possibilities in the production of new meanings. Thus, by redefining truth as a limited set of undeniable elemental truths pertaining to all fields of knowledge, it can ostensibly calculate all possible truths and predict all possible futures. So this is compression and combinatorial logics and recursivity in service to universal truth production. And being universal, it's basically setting up a system whereby there is no outside to the system. If you're outside of the system, to all intents and purposes, you don't exist. And note, and it was kind of beautifully formulated by Athanasius Kircher, the initial reductive impulse is always with a view to ultimate expansion. These are super colonizing systems, super colonizing machines. The ambitions here are absolutely colonial from the start. As Kircher formulated it some 300 years ago, the reduction of all languages to one, the expansion of one language to all. Now, one could, in a sense, if one needed a kind of one-line definition for the project of computation or where computation has got us now, that could just as well be it. Llull further equips us with 9 epistemological tools in the form of 9 interrogatory modes. So when you're using Llull's paper machine to establish truth, these are the 9 questions you need to ask. Whether, what is it, or quiddity, what is it from, why, quantum, how much, quando, when, ubi, where, quo modo, modality, cum quo, with what, with who. If you go on the Guardian's fact-checking platform, fact-checking webpage, it will precisely, if you're trying to kind of fact-check some data or an article you're looking at on, this is precise, it's almost exactly the same list. Nothing has changed in terms of how we test truths, how we test facts. So all of these are still busy on the front line of the current information wars. Llull serially defined throughout his life the relations between the principles and predicates and these tools in their search of their clearest and most efficient presentation. That basically, he's refining what we would now call the user interface. This Ars of conversion is, of course, first and foremost, an Ars of conversion to itself. As part of the induction process, Llull even suggests in the Ars Generalis Ultima that we might test drive these rules on the very idea of the truth itself. And he writes, with rule H, we might ask when truth exists. We answer that if it exists, that it exists when time is sustained in combination with the species of truth, for in the absence of truth, neither time or its species can be true in any way. With rule I, we ask where truth is, we answer that it is outside of falsehood. So he's setting up that time is immanent to truth, truth is outside of falsehood, it follows that truth time is outside of the time that falsehood might exist in. Thus, it also follows that any machine that might house the reproduction of truths, that might be truth generating or fact generating, must exist under a temporal regime that's outside of ours. For ours, as we well know, is riddled with falsity. Here we are, stuck in our bodies with their kind of corporal tendency to err. So the question of a separated time in machines of thought didn't resurface again, and this is very interesting, until Turing's machine, for which time, like memory, was not a constraint. So Leibniz, who worked on a very early computer that I think I'm going to show you a bit later, and then Ada Lovelace, who I hope you know about, and Charles Babbage and so on, were all only concerned with time in terms of speed. time is but we're not concerned with time in terms of a resource. Turing, in a sense, returns to this idea that the time of the computer is outside of our time, and therefore the time of the computer can be an infinitely long tape, denoting infinitely expansive memory. Time which exists not as a continuum, Turing also sets up, we might, not as a continuum we might measure, but as a sequence of changes of state or events that we simply regulate. And if then specification determines whether a mark is left or deleted, or if it reads an empty space, whether this is left or replaced with a sign on the Turing tape in the Turing machine. After this change or not of state that you see going on here, the loop is complete and restarts, and so ad infinitum. George Dyson argues in Turing's Cathedral that the distinction between time in the digital universe and time in ours is one of the very few distinctions we have left. He quotes Bigelow saying, "No clocks. You don't need clocks. You only need counters. There's a difference between a counter and a clock. A clock keeps track of time. We exist in the world of clocks, that is." Returning to Bigelow, a modern general purpose computer keeps track of events. The computer exists in the world of, or the paradigm of events, of state changes. Ernst Bloch places Llull with his aspiring machine, and here it is, or here is a later version of it, that might satisfy what he describes as bourgeois calculation needs in the 400-year-old project of European modernity, although quite how is unclear. Llull was fashionably early by some 300 years. Bloch, in exile in 1930s America, described Llull's Ars Demonstrativa as a logical logarithmic clock, a kind of deduction machine of knowledge that should encompass and exhaust every variation of cognition that was at all meaningfully possible. He might simply have said, as others have said since, that it was, to all intents and purposes, the first computer. While Llull's paper machine used fuzzy words, so we can't really claim these terms as discrete, it did use them as if they were discrete, isn't it? It's turning this like this turns like arms on a clock, as if they have sharp edges and could be treated as discontinuous terms, numbers on the clock face at the back of Bloch's mind, perhaps, even though they clearly still exert a symbolic pull, a tubbing web of metaphoric linkages to their natural language's counterparts. So think again, goodness, greatness, so these are kind of terms that we associate with each other. If Friedrich Kittler called them Turing's universal machine, if Friedrich Kittler called Turing's machine the universal discrete machine, or the manic cutter, Kittler's great term, we might call Llull's ours as the universal very nearly discrete machine, whose cuts were never quite clean. Nonetheless, Llull's extreme combinatorics, whose legacy is now recognized as no less than the Enigma machine, offered a medieval user already what Kittler described in relation to Turing as all the joys of discrete, that is, combinatory mathematics. We might say Turing simply took Llull's machine and turned up the joy factor of combinatorial joy, that is, to 26 letters of the alphabet to the power of 7, that is 8 billion letters. Despite their messy cuts, the loyalty of the words and letters in Llull's Rs to algorithms rather than to natural languages marks a turning point in what Kittler calls the 2,000-year-old war between algorithm and alphabets, between numbers and letters, and their delivery of the truth. Truth that is better because it's mechanized, this is what Llull is setting up, and truth that makes no errors. As a security measure, the Rs' multiplicitous structure allows 20 roots and thus 20 proofs to the answer of any question. This mechanized truth, then, is also deemed better because if it wasn't already, it would soon be much, much faster than the production of truth by words, written or spoken. As Bloch returns to Llull in his 1959 revision of his earlier 1930s book, The Principle of Hope, and just think of the amazing transformation of computation between 1930 and 1959, 1960. He returns and writes, "Today, Llull's arithmetical dream has spawned a whole industry of thinking with the sorcery of speed."
Although 300 years old, its intricate mechanism still functions perfectly today. This calculator created a sensation when it appeared, for it could add, subtract, multiply, and divide automatically. Designed by a French mathematician, it ended a centuries-old search for a machine that could solve complex problems faster and more accurately than the human brain. With the machine Arithmetic as a beginning, man's creative genius has perfected a 20th-century successor, the world's newest, fastest, and most amazing electronic calculator. Supervised by a single operator, it can multiply and divide more than 2,000 times a second and add and subtract 16,000 times a second. Solving an average problem, the calculator performs 14,000 separate arithmetical operations a second. Magnetic tape is used to store data required in working out the solution. More than 2 million digits can be recorded on a single reel of tape.
So I think you get the idea, which is that, as you know, in a sense, he talks about the time barriers is shattered, and the idea that speed as the signature of the machine becomes the new signature of truth. Truth that's better truth because it's faster truth. The Cold War's demand for real-time processing drove a quantum leap in speed, thus delivering Friedrich Kittler's eternal present, the temporal order of all war. The best truth now was not simply faster truth, it was instantaneous truth. Like eternal truth, that is the truth of God, instantaneous truth is also somehow outside of our temporal continuum. And remember, Llull's truth time is outside of our time also. So note that the instantaneous is also a property fit not for a clock, but for a counter. The ternary is long gone in this conversation. Leibniz had resurrected the ancient Indian binary, and similarly, I mean, you saw in the film Pascal's machine Arithmetic, but Leibniz's ratiocinate is very similar. And so he's devised a machine that has a series of cogs here, is discrete. So he has the discrete on the one hand here, and he has the Indian binary on the other hand here, but he doesn't quite bring them together. But Leibniz had looked at Llull, had looked at the ternary or this triadic structure that is gone. Clearly in Leibniz's mind, this machine will be binary. Kittler described the binary paradigm as a logical product of the zero-sum game of warfare. You win, you lose, either or. There is no both and as a logical conclusion to warfare. There is no halfway house, or if there is, it's not to be tolerated. These are the only states that can count, as these are the only states that can dominate. Nothing counts in the eternal present of warfare.
Already the people of one city have been polled as to...
In 1967, in Peter de Normanville's film, Man and Computer, the corrective prediction that is all design meets the now civilized computer, or civilianized, not necessarily civilized. The new battlefield for this computer is the post-war city.
Their preferred living pattern for the end of the century. A computer produced this plan for a city of the future by processing the individual desires of 500,000 people for different types of homes, methods of transport, patterns of leisure and of work, together with the expected population growth and the resources available. But the computer could only offer a series of mathematical concepts.
So note, I mean, this is extraordinary. In 1967, we're having the computer, this conversation about the computer calculating the desires of the inhabitants of the city. It's a kind of extraordinary prefiguration of a lot of the rhetoric that surrounded parametric optimization kind of in the late 90s and around the noughties. And in a sense, prefigures its highly reductive architectural truthhoods that followed. Both the corrective predictions according to Sage and the antecedents to parametricism seen here can be understood then as a direct legacy of the Pansophic projects of the Enlightenment. That's all those systems that we looked at earlier by Kircher, Leibniz, Bruno, and so on. And its project to render everything in not continuous but discrete terms within a system that, by being hermetic and highly compressed, is able to claim universality. But returning to these paper circles in Lull's Ars Magna, and here they are, and their nascent machines, their hybridity ergos. How exactly are we to read them? Are these pictures or are they wheels? Are they representation? Are we to understand the system as a representation, or are we to take them literally as mechanism? Aristotle describes thinking and the production of knowledge as activity. Lull's third degree knowledge, intellectual knowledge of intellectual things, if you remember, in completing the decorporalization Aristotle started, finally disembodied thought. Finally, Lull finally gets thought out of the body. But we know from Aristotle that thought is activity, that thought needs to move. So how does thought move if it's outside of a body? And not least, it needs to move between its three constituent nodes that Lull has set up with his ternary architecture, what he describes as the knower, the known, and the act of knowing, or more beguilingly and more beautifully as the lover, the beloved, and love itself. So thus decorporalized, thought must be lent some other kind of body that moves, but it has to be one without senses, because we've gone to kind of great lengths to separate thought from the senses. It has to be a senseless body. It's the machine. That is, the rehousing of thought in the machine can be understood then as a direct result of Lull's decoupling of thought from Aristotle's senses, and not vice versa, in which thought that is hermetically sealed within the intellect, that is, if we take the Lull triangulation of the intellect by the intellect with the intellect, must somehow, like a lion in its cage, turn in circles in order to satisfy its need to move. But these paper wheels that are allowing this mechanized thought to kind of keep moving, to keep turning, are also facilitating other kind of movement, other kind of cycles. This is one of Lull's algorithms. So, and what we find is that these cycles and the subcycles they set up are autopoietic, that they are able to set up new questions and answer new truths. So truth is clearly kind of transformed through this into an algorithmic artifact, able to produce other algorithms, able to ask itself and answer new questions. In 1671, here you see it, finally, Leibniz takes Lull's wheel with its still fuzzy figures, its words, and in his ratiocinnator lends it cogs, lends it teeth. So the almost discrete here becomes the unequivocally discrete here at base 10 and digital. At the same time, he resurrects the ancient Indian binary. We saw Leibniz's notes earlier. Words are gone and any triadic structure is gone, lost with it the relational web, and lost with it too the middle or undecided option. This because, as Leibniz wrote to Mersenne, once we has realized this language, calculating and reasoning will be the same thing. Thus discreteness, an inherently gross approximation of any continuum, discrete data sets are step data sets, they kind of approximate a curve, secured the way for engineered neutrality that the Rs had already paved. Thus, the construction of neutrality that is now the aboriginal hallmark of the machine of thought, like the decoupling of thought from the senses, was also formulated ex machina, before being installed in the machine, its newly adopted site of origination. The engineered neutrality of the machine of thought has played a role of arbitrator ever since. We saw the strange abdication of authorship produced in parametric design discourse, and now the same engineered neutrality with the advent of machine learning authors not simply the parking of our cars, but also the bail decisions of courts and the tailoring of our very own personalized news feeds. If we go back to our line of philosophers and imagine that we're extruding it, and we let our eyes wander down our imaginary, this kind of imaginary line of rescuing philosophers that come to the rescue of truth, we see that with each, as their falsehoods eradication systems became more discrete in what they included and excluded, more universal in their scope, their application and their suppression of alternatives, more exquisite in their precision, more effective in their colonization and monopoly of the production of truth, the more extraordinary the errors they produced. The verb to err, to drift from a true course, reminds us that the architecture of any algorithm, always an essentially corrective system, even when it's not in delivery of religious conversion, is primarily calculatory. It's primarily a set of corridors and decision gates through which data, thought, is irrigated without fear of deviation. If we could predict something via the temporal fold of induction, we could also control it. This is basically, what von Neumann set up, not to mention that if you can control something, you can also predict it. In 1922, Lewis Fry Richardson published The Weather Prediction by Numerical Processes. Lull's axiomatic argumentation became axiomatic prediction as truth, relocated from the gods to the weather of the gods, in a sense. And in so doing, from eternity to the transients that must always stay one step ahead of real time. A series of algorithms service his notional forecast factory. Here it is. A building with an enormous central chamber, which is in effect a kind of wraparound screen on which is painted a map of the world like a kind of inside-out globe. And here you see it, this kind of inside-out globe of the world. There's an extraordinary description by Richardson of this. And here, these are the human computers calculating behind the screen. So in a sense, it's a kind of inside-out globe. You're on the inside, looking at the screen with the computer beyond the screen. And here is the conductor, because cybernetics is yet to arrive. This is absolutely hierarchical, moving his beam of light across the world as the forecasting is coming in, as the weather is arriving, making sure that everything stays on time. When 20 odd years later, but in an altogether different technological paradigm, that is after the war, von Neumann, as he moved from atomic bombs to weather forecasting, famously promised, quoting Neumann, all stable processes we shall predict, all unstable processes we shall control. As George Dyson points out, a fine line separates approximation from simulation, and developing a model is the better part of assuming control. Dyson writes, Sage kept track of all passenger flights, developing a real-time model that led to Sabre, the semi-automatic business-related environment airline reservation system that still controls much of passenger traffic today, that is when flights resume normally. Google sought to gauge what people were thinking and became what people were thinking. Facebook sought to map the social graph and became the social graph. Algorithms developed to model fluctuations in financial markets, gained control of these markets, leaving human traders behind. And we could continue Dyson's list. We could continue extruding this process and add, say, trading bots developed to scan the news, to make trade predictions, now write the news to make predictions in the trade of fake news for geopolitical profit. We could add tailored news feeding algorithms designed to connect communities with communications, now cleave communities by communications. In 1986, in a strange inverse archaeology, Werner Kunzel and Heiko Cornelius took Lull's Ars Magna and translated it into COBOL, a contemporary programming language, and then into an assembler application, which was inputted into a computer. Lull's triadic system entered the operational space of the contemporary binary digitalized system and its algorithms, whose recursive footprints it would have recognized. It would even have recognized the potential promiscuity of the system's application, because Lull's Ars was intended not simply to convert Jews and Muslims to Christianity, but also to recombine not only Averroes' segregation of logic and theology, but also to combine in rhetoric, literature, metaphysics, in a kind of medieval multidisciplinary space to which new syllogisms and new fallacies might be added to classical ones. So it's a kind of highly transdisciplinary generative space. But it may well, in recognizing all of this, have wondered why indecision, the space of the indeterminate, the space of the unknown, had been structurally excluded from its processing. We might say Lull's machine approximated and corrected thought. The universal Enlightenment languages that followed approximated and corrected their natural language counterparts. Discrete values approximated and corrected any continuum as numerical values approximated and corrected Enlightenment will characters. And lastly, that the binary approximated the indeterminacy implicitly tolerated by Tull's ternary. The triangulation of cybernetic relatedness, represented by the three reasoning heralds at the very front of that parade on the drawing we saw, that still combine any machine of thought, are long gone. These three heralds are reason, will, and memory. Kurt Gödel in 1931, in famously showing that mathematics produces propositions that are not decidable or not provable and therefore not possible to be deciphered by a machine, had revealed through this process an invisible architecture of ever-shrinking horizons. The domain of prediction is redrawn as a smaller subdomain of provability, and that of provability is the even smaller subdomain of that which is provable by binary computation. That which has escaped the geography of all of this, that is the geography of computation, is the random or chance. But the random or chance had already been tamed by the 19th century invention of binomial, of statistics, of flipping the law of error here into the normal curve for any of you that sat through statistics at school, or binomial distribution, as part of the kind of 19th century project of what was called social physics, which remains an extraordinary term. With the aid of mass measure, the extraordinary data scraping or harvest that took place between the 1800s and 1850s, probability had brought caprice, the caprice of chance, to heal. And the authority of nascent statistics was established by another machine, by this extraordinary epistemic machine of singular artifice, Sir Francis Galton's Galton box or quincunx. And so the way this box works, and just a couple more slides, and 2 more slides, I think, then we're done, is it's an open-faced box with a glass front, and you drop a series of pebbles or lead pellets through the top, and they fall through a series of pins. You'll see in a film in just a moment. And the pins are arranged like the number 5 on a dice in the quincunx formation, so they're offset. So as the ball goes down, it hits a pin, and it'll either scatter to the right and scatter to the left. And lo and behold, no matter how many times you do it, the balls always pile up in a normal curve at the bottom. However, as you can see, there are these partitions holding the curve in place, or holding the balls in place, because the steepness of this curve is obviously steeper than the natural angle of repose of the ball. So it's a rhetorical machine. Yes, it's kind of correct physics, but it's kind of souped up, let's say. The books are slightly cooked. So it sounds harmless, but Galton's project was not harmless. Galton's project was eugenics. His was a curve in his terms, and this is an extraordinary quote by Galton, to be worshipped. I know scarcely anything so apt to impress the imagination as the wonderful form of cosmic order expressed by the law of error. A savage, if he could understand it, would worship it as a god. It reigns with severity in complete self-effacement amidst the wildest confusion. The hunger of the mob, and the greater the anarchy, the more perfect its sway. Let the large sample of chaotic elements be taken and marshalled in order of their magnitudes, and then, however wildly irregular they appeared, an unexpected and most beautiful form of regularity proves to have been present all along. So, I mean, listen to this extraordinary rhetoric, present all along, self-effacement, its reign is invisible, the greater the anarchy, the more perfect its sway. I mean, does this not sound really familiar in the age of big data? Renamed probability machine, the Galton box was installed center stage by Charles and Ray Eames in their design for the Mathematica exhibition, and then a couple of years later, symbolically meets the computer in their design for the IBM pavilion, where it stood sentinel at the entrance and was given a starring role in their 1965 film, IBM at the Fair. So you see in the film, we have with a staccato, amazing staccato score by Bernstein, we have this cascade of balls coming down through these pins at the probability machine, and the crowd surrounding, and kind of, whether they're savages or not, worshipping the kind of emerging normal curve that's appearing here. Thus, the opera aperta, so the open work, as Umberto Eco had described Lull's Ars, with its embracing of all possibility via ternary logics, including the possibility, let's get rid of that the other might come without our being able to anticipate their arrival, recalling Derrida's Avenir, had become, through this process, an opera chiusa, a closed work. With us, recently rechristened by Hito Stern as the wretched of the screen, that is, with us like the truth in her tower, or like this boy in the thrall of the symmetry around the normal axis of the cascading balls, trapped inside the logics of predictive systems that never fail because they're designed to exclude all that cannot be predicted in the first place. Such systems leave us imprisoned on the outside of that which is not predicted, of the arrival of the other, that is, the arrival of chance. The same chance that C.S. Peirce in the 19th century describes as a being living and conscious, that all the dullness that belongs to ratiocination self can scarce muster the hardihood to deny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That was a really fascinating talk. I've probably jotted about 3 questions as you would come talking, but maybe it may be a good time to open up the questions to the audience. If anyone's got any questions. Maybe I should.
I had a comment.
No, please, Ajay. Professor Ajay Triani's got a question.
Oh, I don't know if I have a question. I was thinking we had a clash with this lecture and the fire safety visiting lecture. And I was just thinking about that as you were talking. And I was thinking about the space of the university and the way in which we think and learn, and you know, I have myself at length written lately about what Wendy Brown calls the neoliberal subject, the way in which people get made more docile by mechanisms of counting and auditing and checking and monitoring. And I was thinking about this space of critical thinking in the world, not just the university, in life. And the question of what's important, you know. And I was wondering about whether or not you're reflecting, because you're very much questioning this space in which we're existing through a discourse about computational technology and its logic and its systemic evolution. But I think it's something more about a shift in a space which I think questions the very nature of what remains important within this very busy process of production and speed and calculation. And I don't know, have you reflected about your work in that domain?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I'm delighted by your question because you completely get what I'm getting at, it seems to me, and I mean, firstly, this is not, the work is trying to, in unpacking the histoire longue durée of computation, which has been with us from the start, I would argue, to reveal the extraordinary architecture, the extraordinary price of the reductive systems that we surround ourselves with. And obviously that goes way beyond, this is not just about parametric design, and having spent the last couple of years dealing with the brutalization of the kind of neoliberal machine that really has got, certainly Australian universities, it's kind of got it by the jugular, got it by the throat. One can precisely see exactly what all these systems, what the systems of measure that started in, well, I kind of whipped through it in unseemly haste, but was the Enlightenment project, but actually really, really happened with Babbage in the 19th century, with this kind of, he talks about building the granary of science, filling the attic with data, as if he kind of somehow knew that this steam-powered industrialization of arithmetic he was producing was going to be really hungry for data. And if you fed it a whole load of data, it would be able to dominate everything. And boy, was he right. And, we increasingly, and it has very direct consequences for architectural practice, as that horrific promotional video by Blocks or Archistar, I forget which one it was at the beginning, shows. And we're increasingly, we have allowed ourselves to be painted into the most extraordinary corner and have become very docile, as you say.
And it's all fine for everybody who wasn't taught and nurtured within that system, because we still have a really important place, I would argue, for radical thinking, possibility, everything that doesn't make sense actually deserves contemplation. But I kind of wonder, when you've been nurtured within a system that makes you docile, how you can contest in a critical way the practice, or maybe it happens naturally, I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I think architecture schools have an incredibly important role to play right now. In a sense, architecture is the least of the jobs we have to do. We've got to have we've got to keep teaching people how to think. And I have been really going back to Beckett a lot. I mean, the filthy logic is Beckett's term. And really, looking at his use of the absurd as an attack on the kind of hegemony of purpose, the hegemony of function, and actually really returning, in a sense, pointless activities, unoptimized activities, the egg and spoon race, for instance, suddenly just take on profound meaning again, because, this is, I think Joan Oakman talks about the unfettered desire of the studio space, and that has to be protected. And I think architectural academics all over the world have been incredibly brilliant at protecting that as they pivoted, to use that dreadful word, but let's just not use it, as they were forced to teach studio on Zoom, and it's how we look after that, because that has been eradicated, and it's happening in every discipline. And in a sense, architectural education becomes one of the last bastions of unfettered desire, or egg and spoon races.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ijaya. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Matthew.
Hi, Francesca. Thank you very much for the talk. Wonderful. I was interested to see what you thought about these kind of paradigms of knowledge and truth, how they interacted and rubbed shoulders with each other. And I'm thinking about the paradigm of religion, or the paradigm of alchemy, and then the paradigm of algorithmic thinking, all kind of competing for a truth. And I'm just wondering, are there examples where they cross-pollinate or infiltrate each other, or are they always on this kind of power surge to try and be the dominant force? Because you can still see it today, definitely, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'm not remotely qualified to answer it. But I mean, certainly, you know, Averroes was able to carry the contradiction of things could be theologically true, but logically incorrect, and logically true and theologically incorrect. And he didn't have a problem with that. And Llull had a problem with that. And what's kind of interesting then is that Llull devises this secular system, but the job of the secular system is religious conversion. So, you know, where does that go? And of course, you know, there's all kinds of, the algorithm is in everything, is in each of those paradigms, is in alchemy and so on. So there's never, you know, this is the thing, things are never as discrete as they are packaged to be. And there's a kind of the messiness of those edges between those different paradigms that ostensibly win over each other, but actually there's so many own goals in those apparent victories.
And it reminds me of the kind of we're holding up a mirror to ourselves all the time. And it's a matter of going back to Brecht and ideas of estrangement, of how to break the mirror, how to kind of create new emergent properties. But no, fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed your talk, so thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think the mirror, are you familiar with Stuart Brisley's work, performance artist?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. So it's Brechtian in many ways, but he uses the mirror very powerfully, literally. You'll be watching this 8-hour performance art thing, and then he picks up a giant mirror and holds it to the audience, and to your horror you see yourself, and the whole bubble bursts. And it's I guess, I mean, back to the kind of earlier conversation, there's just a lot of bubble bursting that we have to keep doing in architectural education. You know, we're locked into these neoliberal hermetic systems, measuring systems, accounting systems, you know, goal attaining and target measuring systems. And one has to just keep, in a sense, taking the pin to those bubbles and just reminding ourselves that this is all an artifice, and there is a big, complicated, messy world out there, a lot of which we can't predict, thank God, you know. And that chance is living and conscious, as Peirce says. I just love that quote.
No, very true.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think I may have one, and it's picking up on some of the thoughts that Ijaya and Matthew have kind of put forward. And so there's this kind of, I guess, a fetish with prediction or optimization, which kind of affords a certain colonization of thinking, whether it's through critical thinking or whether it's in terms of architectural practice. And then on the other hand, there's this sense of, I guess, messiness that can alter the course of this regulated network. So considering that we are in the system of education now, but at the same time, we are hopefully preparing our students to be able to, on one hand, operate in the world of practice, and yet at the same time, question it and kind of open it up. What are the ways through which we can kind of enable and exploit this messiness? And have you come across any more recent models where that's being done and that's more directly kind of responding to some of these issues of truth telling? I mean, in terms of politics and kind of questions of war and conflict, I can think of the work of forensic architecture or some of the work by Laura Kurgan at MIT. Can you think of any, are there any other kind of models that the students could reference?
That's a really good question. I mean, forensic architecture is a good example. A lot of the work that will be, I mean, I think Leslie Loco is working on a book right now that will be published in a kind of couple of years, I imagine, just looking a lot at different pedagogic models and what she was doing in Johannesburg I mean, that's some very interesting work coming out of the GSA there. I think it's going on in lots of schools. I guess in terms of where, certainly there was a lot of interesting stuff going on at UTS in the studios that are really almost thinking about the post-human to make things more messy. And so in terms of a practice that I can think of right now that is illustrating that, it's difficult. But I mean, I'm looking at your bookshelf behind you, you've got extra straight craft. Kelly Easterling's work certainly does that. And the work that she's exhibited in the last couple of biennales and that she does with her studio certainly is a good example of that. I mean, I think students, in my experience, students get it, you know, and they are questioning a lot of boundaries and they're seeing whole parts of the curriculum as not necessarily relevant. It's really interesting where they're pushing the curriculum to go. Certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, and Australia is in the Southern Hemisphere, you know, it's kind of, even though it's kind of northern in so many senses, it is definitely of the South, and the kind of colonial legacy there is horrific, horrendous. And the kind of decolonization project is very live and very much driven by students in the school. You know, and there's a real understanding that decarbonization and decolonization are completely inseparable. You know, that one can't do one without the other. And so there's a real radicalization of the students' relationship to the curriculum. They're demanding change. So I think, you know, rather than thinking of examples of 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds out there in practice, I think students should just be looking at each other's work, really, in a way. Because they're, in my experience, they're very smart and very angry, and they know exactly what they need to do.
Thank you for that. Jo, did you have another question? Or?
Oh, I was thinking of something that a friend of mine's just moved from an English university to go and work in Sweden. And she messaged me, we had a Skype chat just recently, and she was saying there is no marking. So she's teaching in an architecture school, which has no mark sheets. And she was talking about what that does when you're teaching, when there's no obligation to do assessment, and how it changes what the conversations are and how the work is produced. And I was thinking about whether or not that would ever be possible to return to, because actually I don't remember getting mark sheets when I studied. I don't remember the criteria of assessment. And I wonder, you know, and I kind of thought, well, it's just not playing the game, is it? you know, you refuse to play the game. And is part of this space about just not playing the game with the rules as it's currently set, you know? And I wonder about all the mutations in which that can happen, that you are perpetually resisting that revalidation of a system. And the other thing I wanted to add was a very funny thing. I was looking up today for a meeting that we have. So research in England is assessed through this thing. Universities get ranked on research excellence.
Yeah.
And it's called REF students. And I was looking up what architecture is. It's number 13, but it comes under engineering. But some of us in the school come under art and design, which is number 32. Now the ranking from 1 down starts from science, with more liberal arts coming down the numbering system. And I'd never realized before. And I thought that is so fascinating to think that even the way that excellence is defined is kind of graded through that system. There's almost like not a single thing that isn't going through this assessment criteria, giving it value or withdrawing value from it. I don't know, I just thought it was really incredible.
Yeah, that is incredible. But I mean, the kind of research framework, as we know, is we're being shoehorned into a research assessment process that was designed for the sciences. So it's the same with ERA in Australia, the Australian equivalent of REF. And that's, I think that is something that is improved and reformed here. I mean, ERA is like REF was at the beginning. It's horrendous. It's really the cookie cutter doesn't fit. It's been somewhat reformed in the UK, but the pass fail. I mean, if I could have, then that's the next thing I would have done, is get rid of marking. And in a sense, Nicolina, maybe that comes back to your question. I think pass fail is really healthy, and makes it quite clear that feedback is not some transactional negotiation, but there's this, you know, there is a kind of much more complex and much more horizontal learning exchange going on in the studio environment. And there are lots of precedents of schools producing outstanding work on the pass fail, but they were always slightly rogue schools. But it's a great resistance. If you can do it, it would be a fantastic way to resist the university systems. If you can design what Christine Hawley would call the firewall. It'd be interesting to ask the students what they thought about reverting to a pass-fail, or converting, I should say, to a pass-fail system.
Great.
I've thought a bit about that actually, because as the projects have developed now, that as we are working on it, we always look to like the submission sheet, like what we need to have to like also the criteria, and like what we need to, like the boxes we need to tick to get a good grade. And it's not so much anymore about discovering, or like it's not so much longer about developing something like new and exciting, like something you want to work with in the same way. It's more about reaching like a good mark.
Yeah, it's a problem. It's a real problem, because in a sense, one can learn an enormous amount. Arguably, one learns the most from mistakes, and in a sense, one needs to carve out a space for failure within this kind of grade chasing madness, because that's often where the real education comes. And I don't mean failure, you know, you're a lazy bugger and you don't do anything. I mean failure like you really stick your neck out there and you try and do something difficult and it just doesn't work, or it works in some way that doesn't work, or you start to use that to rethink the criteria. And when we talked to students in Sydney about shifting to pass fail, it was very interesting. Half of them just said, yes, let's do it tomorrow, not a problem, fantastic, you know, that's kind of how we're thinking anyhow. And then half of them were like, no, hang on a minute, I need to I'm paying money, I'm paying money, I'm a client here, I need a percentage I can trust, I need a grade I can trust that is my, in a sense, what I'm taking back from the system. And I need to be able to measure myself against others.
I guess it also becomes a learning framework for further advancement. That's then an argument I've heard a lot. So all the feedback is meant to provide, and the marking, some sort of leverage for refinement and evolving the skill sets. But I think you mentioned it just then, that it's directly related to education being a service and money.
Yeah, I mean, pass-fail isn't to say you don't give very detailed written critical feedback that clearly, you know, pushes the work and makes clear work that's more sophisticated from work that's less sophisticated. It just means you don't put a number to it.
I completely agree. Like I come from an education where there was no mark, it just pass or fail. And I don't remember being het up or anxious about marks either. It wasn't part of the rhetoric. It was about the project and the kind of level of engagement that the project stimulated within the crit room scenario type thing. But yeah, that's a few years ago.
I mean, back to the bookshelf behind Nicolina, Keller Easterling kind of famously put it is that, you know, the more precise the system becomes, the more exquisite the errors it produces, you know, and our measuring and marking and learning outcomes and assessment criteria, you know, it's just become this kind of extraordinary elaborate, super, well, allegedly precise, full of redundant precision, I would argue, system that produces this ridiculous errors, because in a sense you end up producing a system that consumes a lot of academics' time and energy and a lot of students' emotional energy and so on, with appeals and comparisons and cross negotiations. I mean, we've all been in it. It's horrendous, you know, the time we've wasted dealing with marks, whereas everyone, all good teachers and actually most students walk in a room and you know what work is good and what work is not good enough, you know. And in a sense, if that, you know, given that we all know that, we could just be spending the time discussing what we're doing and what's working and what's not working and why the work is good and why it's not good, rather than quibbling over percentage points, which, I mean, you know, I do lots of external examining. Every school is just like got this horrendous waste of energy dealing with quibbling over percentage points, either between each other or with students. We all know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be the best rejection of the neoliberal machine. It's just to be.
Yeah, I think somebody needs to go to the SCOSA meeting, the heads of architecture school, and we all vote.
Yeah,
that we're going to do it, because the ROBA is not going to do that. It's actually going the other way. So it could be quite interesting. But I mean, you know, reflect in another X number of years, will it have turned in a different way? I don't know.
It's something that's interesting about the grading, like you're saying, with the because when you're grading, you're sort of relating the work to a predefined system. So like back to sort of the algorithms and things, so you don't get that kind of unknown thing as much.
Yeah.
Possible.
And I think it's actually kind of really serious right now, because certainly I was feeling in Australia that the system, this grading system, was preventing, and the kind of interface that it makes with the rest of the university was actually preventing architecture schools from doing what architecture schools need to do right now. If architecture schools really are to tackle the incredible project of decarbonisation, decolonisation, we need to be free to really make lots of mistakes, to really experiment, to really think outside of the box, to really put aside any disciplinary anxieties or prejudices. And, you know, you trip at the first hurdle, which is the stupid marking system.
Mm. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to return to Derrida, if you could, just for a second, because he argues that you can't have an interior unless you've got an exterior. You need both conditions. At some point, you know, for the existence of one, you need the other of anything. And I really like that thinking, and I really agree with that thinking. And I wonder if it's that space that is the space of possibility. Understanding that the unknown and the known need to coexist. But then how we enact that, I'm not quite sure.
Yes, but we can have more intelligent knowns than the knowns we're currently operating with.
Oh no, of course. Oh no, if anything, it's been so simplified. I'm worried that, you know, and particularly when you look at university speak, you know, people are now kind of speaking with words that are so standard that we all know, with acronyms, that I think that at one point we'll just be down to 5 acronyms that describe the whole university's agenda, and somehow somebody will be happy. It'll just get to that point.
Indeed.
Yeah. So thank you. It was such a fabulous talk. It really was.
My pleasure. Thank you for the great discussion, great questions.
Thank
And
you.
I'm so sorry about the clash. I do apologize for
Oh,
that.
not to worry.
But it's okay. I think this intimate kind of environment kind of facilitated some of the questions that perhaps wouldn't have been asked if we had a large audience. But we'll certainly share this link with all of our colleagues and students. So thank you so much, Francesca, and looking forward to your forthcoming book, which I'll certainly buy. It'll be on my bookshelf, not just on my bookshelf, but I'll make sure to go through it and read it. And hopefully we stay in touch, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Yeah, and thank you, Nicolina, for organising it. Thank you very, very much. It was really fabulous.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.